So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This online presentation brought to you by the Bega Valley Data Collecting on growing your small business with data. And it's been proudly funded by the New South Wales Small Business Month. So we've just scraped in to fit into their time frame, but we'll also be doing some more activities around this that'll extend after November. And we're recording this event as well for anybody who missed it or wants to replay this webinar. So just to introduce myself, I'm Tim Whitaker. I'm a member of the Bega Valley Data Collective, and I guess we should kick off with an acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we live, meet and work. We wish to pay respects to elders past and present and recognise the continuous connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people to land, water and country. So the Bega Valley Data Collective, just a bit of background on that. We're a new member-based not-for-profit organisation, and our project is to build Australia's first community-owned and run data space here in the Bega Valley. If you want to know a bit more about what we're doing and what we're up to, you can go to our website, begavalley.data.com.au. I might kick things off by looking at what actually is data. What's the definition of data? And this is from the Webster Dictionary, and it's quite broad when you look at it. Things known or assumed as facts making the basis of reasoning or calculation. So when you think of that, it's pretty broad when we talk about data. We often think of data as technical and new, but when reading that acknowledgement and looking at that definition of data, we've been collecting data going back tens of thousands of years, and it could be in the forms of artwork or paintings or other communications our Indigenous people used a long time ago. And that collecting that information is the base of reasoning of calculations that is going on today. So big data, there's a lot of data. What things have changed is the amount of data collecting. So just give you an idea how big data is. So the amount of data in the world at the end of 2020 is estimated at 44 zettabytes. And if you want to know what a zettabyte is, I think it's about 21 zeros following 44. So a heap amount of data. And just how much data we're generating every day. 463 exabytes. That's about, I think it's about 16 zeros. So a huge amount of data that we're generating and collecting each day. So what do we make of all this data? What I'm going to do now, I'm going to throw over to and introduce you to another member of the Data Collective and good friend, April Merrick. And April is also the Grants Program Manager for FRRR for New South Wales and ACT. So welcome, April, and can you fill us in a bit more about refining data?
Thanks, Tim. Yes, so the refining data. So data, as it says, isn't really useful in its raw state, has little value. The data refinement process is probably the most important process, but it's sometimes neglected. So it's really when you take that big data and you categorize it, you clean it, you make it useful so that you can ask questions of it. So the data refinement process really makes data useful, and it can be converted into answers to questions. So it's making big data smaller through refining it. So it's almost like taking the oil, which is the data, the new oil, and refining it to make it into the perfection that you can to run a high performance sports car. So yes, so the refinement process is really important, and that's really where you need a data analyst or some support to make sure that you can refine it to the right state that you can answer those questions. You can ask and answer questions. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, April. And I should just mention, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So if you can hang on any questions, and if you think of a question as we go, you can always type it into the chat box. And now I introduce another good friend of mine, Sarah Cooper, and a colleague. And Sarah's also a member of the Bega Valley Data Collective and a consultant on all things economic and economic development. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Tim, and hi, everyone. I got the revised slides about 4 minutes ago, so I was actually prepared to cover something else, but this is probably more down my line of work and background. So I don't have a formal answer as to what data's role in economic development is, except that I've been working in economic development probably the last 15 years, and you basically don't have any sense of economic development without proper, up-to-date and good data. So we relied on it very strongly throughout all the decisions. I was at Eurobodalla Shire Council for 12 years in economic development. And subsequently, I've been working with an economist in Brisbane on all around Australia on business cases and economic development strategies and different other strategies, and helping government, mainly local government, and companies make decisions as to, you know, what to invest in, all that. And, you know, like they said at it wasn't a forum, it was the National Economic Development Conference that Tim refers to there, data is gold. And no one had that as a heading in their presentation, but throughout 3 days of presentations, and from overseas guest speakers to, you know, many very good speakers from around Australia, that was basically the message. And it was interesting because of what we're starting here in the Bega Valley, to be able to make that connection with where the thought was out there. And this is, you know, I don't know, you know, and there was a lot of data companies represented there, and a lot of, you know, it was just a strong focus. All the exhibitors were sort of data focused. So basically the role is probably the primary. There's not one strategy document or even piece of work that we've ever done that doesn't start with data. And I think for businesses, because if this gets shared with some of the small businesses, your data is your business intelligence is what we're talking about. It helps you make decisions. It helps you analyze what you've done, where you are now, and especially what I love is some of the forecasting tools that give you, using the data today, that allow you to have a look at, you know, what your target market might be looking like in a few years, and it helps you decide where to invest and how to grow your business and all that. So basically the update, I've done it from the National Economic Development Conference, it was all about data. And yeah, it was just really refreshing to see which way the data collective is going, and why we're here today, really. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And I'll just introduce to another member of the data collective before we move on to our guest speakers. And that's a good old buddy of mine, sailing buddy of mine, Peter Harvey. And Peter is also Community Connections Manager with Disability Trust. Over to you, Pete.
Yep, great, thanks. Yes, so hello everyone. Certainly with my hat on as a manager for a not-for-profit organisation, the shift in government funding from sort of like big, long funding contracts through to shorter project-based applications for funding in the not-for-profit sector, data becomes a really important factor in terms of like supporting funding applications. Sometimes we have a main source of income through ongoing funding through, you know, government-based or private funding, but the data can also assist in developing the basis for applications to extend that funding base. So I think that not-for-profits can really broaden their income base, and they can also make some further steps towards the goals of what their organisation is aiming for in the community. I'd just also like to say that the role of the data collective in the way that it presents the data, and the role of the data analyst within that, and I'm sure people will talk about what the data analyst does in a bit more detail, but the way that the data can be presented supports the storytelling within the application as well. So it gives a really clear sense of what's possible as well. So for not-for-profits, I think it's a really great idea to be using data. It certainly gives that empirical evidence for the purpose of funding applications, which government agencies are always looking for, rather than subjective stuff, and the benefit can be the whole community. Thanks, Tim.
Right, thanks, Pete. Thanks for that. So that was just a bit of an introduction and now we're going to throw over to our guest speakers. So first guest speaker is a good friend of the Data Collective and Executive Officer of the Bendigo Bank, both the branches here in Pambula and Bega. And I'll just a bit of a background to Graham. He's 35 plus years as a corporate accountant for companies you may know: Nestles, BHP Steel, AHM, Private Health Insurance, TAFE New South Wales, the Bega Valley Shire Council. I think hopefully that you might provide some insights in the current financial state of the Bega Valley Shire Council, and the Eden Killer Whale Museum. And I didn't really know this, but also runs his own registered training company with his wife, Training Masters. So over to you, Graham, and can you tell us a bit more about how data can be used by small businesses?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tim. Sorry, I'm a bit in the dark here, not in my normal office, but the idea of using data effectively is really bring us out of the dark. So a nice little metaphor by accident there. Yeah, look, a corporate accountant for over 35 years, but I didn't do that taxi stuff. I've always been in the field of analysis, budgeting, that sort of thing. So my whole working life has been around trying to find data in a business and data that relates to a business, and how does that relate to what we're doing. And over the last 25 to 30 years, something that I've done on the side is also mentoring small businesses, startups. And it's really just as important, if not even more important, for those small startup businesses to gather the data and try and turn that into information. As April said, you know, data in itself isn't that useful. But once you get enough data over a period of time, you can start to see trends, and that starts to become information. And so it starts to underline your decisions, and being successful in your business, big or small, is all about the quality of decisions that we make. We don't always get our decisions right, but if we collect the data and then we try and collect the comparative data at multiple points in time, then we can start to see if there's trends. And as important as getting those numbers is getting our analysis, our assumptions that we made. What does that data mean to us at a point in time? How did we use that data at a point in time to make our decisions? When we go forward 3, 6, 12 months and we revisit those decisions that we've made, have things gone well? Did they go well because the assumptions we made based on that data have actually turned out to be correct? Or was the data a little bit misleading based on what we know and how we interpret it? Have we learnt something new? So it's important just to try and get as much of a time series, and how does that relate to our business? For instance, when we're starting a small business, is it good to locate near our competitors? How well are our competitors doing? So how much information can you get on that? Because it might be the perfect place to locate as close as possible to your competitors, because they've got enough business coming in there that you create a little hub for your sort of business. In other circumstances, it might be better for you not to be right next to your competitor, because they can saturate that available market there. So how are you interpreting this data and turning it into information? And that's when it becomes truly useful. But as I say, not just the numbers, it's our thinking. So record, along with where you store your data, the thinking around that data as well. I'm such a sports nerd. I was watching the Formula One the other day, and the thing that really caught me is on every lap in the top Formula One teams, they collect over 500 gigabytes of data off the cars as they do one lap of a circuit. So 2 laps is one of your external hard drives, 1 terabyte. But it's just a whole lot of numbers until they match it up with where that data was collected as they go around the circuit. So their lap around the circuit for our business might be 1 season. Is it the holiday season? Is it our winter period on the coast where we don't get so many visitors? Although this year we've had a lot more visitors. Why is that? Is it because people aren't traveling overseas as much? So we can collect data if we've got what we think might be happening. Can we find the data to actually prove or disprove what we're thinking, or our hypothesis, if you like? So one of my previous lives working in private health insurance, we had access to the data of everybody that was privately insured in Australia effectively. Didn't know the individuals' names. So if we thought our patterns of people claiming were changing, we could try and find, was there some sort of particular disease that was common, and where was it spreading, that sort of thing. If we just looked in the huge database that we had access to, there was too much noise there to find trends. So we had to try and think, well, what is the question that we're trying to answer? Can we find it? So sometimes it's better to look that way rather than just look into a big bucket of data and try and find something meaningful. Better to have an idea or a question that you're trying to answer with that information in mind.
Thanks,
I
Graham.
can talk for hours if you want me to, but I think better to answer some questions later on.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I think in my mind, there was a few questions I'd like to ask you on that. So I think that'd be a good way to finish things off. So thanks much for sharing your valuable knowledge and experience, Graham. And I might throw over to introduce Christy. And we're really privileged at the Bega Valley Data Collective to have Christy and the team at SEER join us and help us in building our data space. So they're looking to be the technology provider and provide some of that analytics to be able to, what Graham says, make sense of all that data out there. Just a bit of background on Christy. She's an inspirational thought leader, published author, industry leader, and on the use of data for social benefits. And that's where we were really attracted to SEER. There's a lot of data analytic companies out there, but SEER are the ones who are focused at the community level, where we really want to capture our data and make it measure what matters. Christy is CEO of CEO Data and Analytics, and was named one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence by the Australian Financial Review. So, Christy, it's over to you. And I think at this stage, I think I've got to stop sharing my presentation so you can start yours. So I'll do that.
Thanks, Tim, for that very kind introduction. I was just hoping that you could enable multi-share for me, please.
Yeah.
And I love all the comments that we heard earlier from everybody. In particular, I just want to highlight data is gold, yet, which is what Sarah said, yet April reminded us that only if you can actually turn it into something that's useful and that the benefits the whole community, as Peter said, and then of course, Graham, have a question in mind to then determine how to find the data that you need.
I think you should
So I'm going to talk.
Yep.
What's that? Sorry, you've got it?
You're right.
Thank you. Yes. So I am just going to start from the beginning, and I've got maybe 10 minutes to go through. Please ask questions as we go through. So how do we think about what small businesses can use to really drive innovation, drive decision making, get more value, especially as Graham talked about those early businesses, startups, etc. How can data be a useful resource, particularly publicly available data? So there's data obviously that sits within your own organisation, within your own business that you're collecting, transactional data, financial data, potentially, of course, if you're a larger business, HR related data, operational data, data on your supply chains, etc., on product development, on your customers. What I wanted to focus on is how you could actually use data that's available publicly to drive better decision making, because there are a number of great assets that exist that are specifically supporting innovation, and I wanted to talk about that. And as Tim kindly introduced us, we're a data partner and data sharing platform predominantly for people who are working in their communities, businesses, not-for-profits, community organisations, governments, all use here to share and access data, publicly available data, and also bring in their own data and visualise that and analyse that. And so we're really pleased to be able to share the work. And for anyone who's interested, you can access the SIB platform and use publicly available data assets for free. And there are a number of those on there. At the last count, I think we're up to around 60 data assets that are publicly available. And for the most part, you can drill down into what's happening in the Bega Valley and understand more broadly information that you might need that could inform some of your decision-making, particularly strategic decision-making, or as Graham talked about, looking at what's changing in our community over time that you can either consider or take advantage of. I just want to take it up a level and talk a little bit about Australia's data-led policy and investments. So the Australian government last year launched the Australian Data Strategy. It's the first strategy that we've had nationally to define how we use data as a society and as for our economy. And through that data strategy, there are a number of different initiatives in place and different definitions on the value of that data that's held and used by government agencies and by businesses and by our social sector across Australia. So some of these are pretty big numbers here, as you can see. The value of data, 34 billion is the estimated value of the economy-wide impact on the use of public sector data, and that's data that government collects and also makes available in some instances, and what we call publicly available or open data. And then what they're estimating, the Department of Finance is estimating, is $64 billion or contribution that data can make to Australia's GDP of open data that's publicly available. So quite often, as you would all be aware, government agencies of all different types make data publicly available on open data, data.gov.au, and New South Wales has open data portals, and there are many, many open data portals that exist where government agencies are publishing data. And I'll talk about the challenge of that in a moment and the opportunity of that. In addition to the investments in open data, making that data available to drive innovation, small business growth, better decisions, more efficiency, and local policy development and regional development, as we heard earlier, there are a number of other investments and legislative changes to make data more available and usable. The first is the Data Availability and Transparency Act, which is very nicely tagged as the acronym for a data scheme. And that is basically making it legal for government agencies to share data between each other, as well as with the university sector. This does not yet include the private sector and business and not-for-profit sector. However, the scheme is in its infancy, and it's part of the legislation is to review the scheme within the first 3 years. So within the next 2.5 years, we'll see a review of the scheme. It's unfortunate that the private sector was excluded from the first legislative change to make data assets more readily available and shareable with businesses. However, that was a last minute removal to really get this legislation through the Parliament at the end of last year. However, what we see is that the value of these data assets will be made more broadly available through not-for-profits and to the private sector. So I guess the key message here is for everybody who's very interested in how data assets can drive your business growth to be aware that in the next 2.5 years, we suspect the private sector will be part of this scheme, which essentially means you'll be able to search across all government agencies on what data assets they hold and what could be useful for you to think about driving your growth. Now, just to give you an idea, the Federal Department of Education, which is only one federal department, of course, has 130 what they call domain data assets that they're curating and stewarding to make that available. They haven't made those publicly available, but over time, and if you can imagine, if you are a service provider providing services to early education and care, schools, or even in transition to tertiary education, those data assets that they hold could be incredibly useful for you to understand how you could better generate services that make sense in your local community in Bega and the Bega Valley. So the big picture is really here, the legislative framework is really driving toward the private sector and small business getting access to data. More and more publicly available data is published on open data portals. And then over time, particularly in the next 2.5 years when this legislation is reviewed and hopefully the private sector is included, you'll be able to search all the data assets that exist within governments to really drive that outcome that you would like to see. I'm going to touch on a couple of other things, which is essentially the data capability building that's happening across Australia in data skill sets. And data skill sets really, they're diverse. And for those of you who are interested in, if I was going to skill up a little bit more in data and using data, the first place that I would look is this data capability building that the Australian Public Service is doing for all government agencies. There are 26 data capabilities and they're at 3 different levels. And I would really encourage you to look at that, because if that's a area where you're keen to build your own skill sets, then things like communicating data, visualizing data, recognizing data as an asset and what sits within your business. In addition to that, how would you collect data and share data? These are all the sorts of capabilities that the Australian government is investing in, not only in its own organisation, across the APS, but more broadly, we believe there's a really strong case for business data capability building and not-for-profits as well. And then there are a range of other investments, including the AI hubs, artificial intelligence hubs, investment in data sharing agreements between governments and businesses with local communities to close the gap, particularly for First Nations communities and for local communities, understanding what's happening contextually and how you can contribute to that change that you want to see. And I think that's what we're aiming to do together, Tim, when we build out the Bega Valley Data Collective. So it's a very exciting moment to be working in the data space, and there's so much opportunity. And for businesses that are going to be coming on board and aware of the opportunities, it's very exciting. However, I would say, and touched on this slightly, that data is incredibly overwhelming for all of us who work in this space. It's just more and more information, more data available. It can be confusing, and indeed it is disconnected. Even open data portals, publishing data, it's very hard to figure out how do you pull all of that data together if you're trying to answer a question, standardize it and prepare it. So we see that data's huge potential as this great asset to drive innovation, to drive growth, to support public benefit outcomes in our communities and for the economic development of places like the Bega Valley is not fully realised, because part of it is our data capability, but part of it is how easy is it to work with. And so this part of the problem that we at SEER are trying to solve, making data catalogues available, easy to analyse and use to visualise if you don't have skill sets. It's a work in progress, of course, but the whole idea is democratising data access so that we can all use data, particularly when you're driving your growth for your business. So there are so many data assets that can be quite helpful. And I think Graham talked about, what are your questions? The kinds of questions we're hearing from local businesses, from collaboratives, from not-for-profits are things like, how do we solve the housing and rental crisis in our local community? How do we think about energy transition and lowering the costs of energy transition for our community members? And that could be coming at it from a business perspective, but also from a whole of community perspective. What are the economic pathways for young people in our community, and how are they transitioning through those important life stages as they go from through school into further education or other types of skills and training? What are some of the concerns that affect our community that are actually impacting the growth and the ability for our whole community to thrive? And what do those early interventions look like? Family violence, of course, is a very important issue across all of Australia. And there are a number of other issues, including getting our kids ready for school, maximising the opportunity for all people to engage in the workforce, and a number of other domains. And then, of course, how do we support business growth, which is what we're here to talk about today. I wanted to just really quickly highlight the kinds of skill sets that we're seeing emerge in small businesses and within communities. And I think what's really exciting about this is that you don't have to be an analyst to get involved and be engaged in using data as a useful, helpful tool. So small business owners may feel that they're not data ready, but there are all these really rich and interesting components to building data stories and building capability. So the kinds of capabilities we're seeing is, of course, you need leaders who understand the value of data and the kinds of questions you can ask of data. You might need domain experts who have a really specific understanding of what might be happening, for example, in aged care, and how your business can contribute to that. You need data enthusiasts, people that might be sitting within different government agencies that can support you in your growth, or other business partners like Bega Bank and others in the community. You need data custodians who are willing to share data. And that's incredibly important as we start to think about all the assets that can be used for decision making. You need storytellers. And in fact, or translators. And I think that's the area that I feel most comfortable with myself, not being highly technical, but wanting to also inquire and tell stories about what the data is showing and what actions, you know, I can take as a small business owner to then drive that forward. Of course, analysts are important. And what's exciting about this moment in time is that this pathway for digital and data skills in local communities is really accelerating. So we're seeing people who are transitioning from other lines of work or other industries into analytical work. And I think that's really, really exciting because it provides an interesting pathway for employment and for a different career focus for people. And then domain experts, which is, as I said earlier, really what your area of expertise might be to ask the right questions. Data scientists, we have a few of those. They're pretty hard to find these days in the data age. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to decentralize and make data more accessible and usable for everybody to use because those data scientists are going to be oftentimes absorbed by some of the large organizations, governments, or large corporates to do really high-end artificial intelligence work. So where it's going for all of us in communities and small businesses is this idea of having data at your desk, catalogued, available. I think what we're going to see more and more is the availability of data, not just open data, but data that is shared and available more broadly so that that information can be used for your businesses, and it's fast, it's not prohibitive, and that you are building that capability for the future. I guess the key thing I wanted to just also show you and highlight to you is Census is an absolutely brilliant resource. And if you all haven't yet had a chance to really understand what is happening as what the census has told us, and of course, that was published and different parts of the census data assets are being published over time. But for the most part, it's been fully published now. There are some really interesting changes. And of course, because the census is the largest data collection, happens every 5 years in Australia, and it's available at a local level, I'd really encourage you to look at that and look at what changes have occurred in the Bega Valley and how that compares to other places around Australia and what that opportunity might be for small business. But at a very high level, we have an aging population. It's not a surprise to us, but certainly the census and the counter census, we've seen a 15% increase in, the retirement age population has increased from 15.7% of the total population to 17.22. And so you can drill down locally in your area to understand what that looks like. And to do that, you can jump into the SIB platform. There's some information available here for you for free, and you can edit that and look at that. And I think Tim also has some resources that are coming from the ABS as well that help you interrogate publicly available data to help you understand what's going on. The other thing that is important to note is there's a large income and gender pay gap. No surprise to us that this is the case, but this has persisted. And there's a very big gap, of course, between the sexes, men and women, and those high income areas. So again, looking what, in the Bega Valley and seeing what might be useful is incredibly helpful. There's, of course, the increased living costs, again, not a surprise, and the pressure on living costs in regional Australia is quite phenomenal. And so looking at this compared to other places could be quite helpful, or even places within Bega Valley across your geographies. Because in case you're looking for where you might establish a retail outlet, a new business, some of this really ought to be data informed so that you can set yourself up for success. And then a number of other components around, changes in the census the number of people who've never been married has increased quite significantly. And then divorce, of course, and a number of other components. So I'd really encourage you to jump in and see what matters in the census. Take a look, and you can look at that based on, you can edit that based on what's happening in the Bega Valley. So that's what I wanted to go through today, Tim. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks. And as always, you've given very insight into what's happening in the data world, but also how we can use it to benefit all in our community. Just want to, can I request you just make me host, and I'll just bring up my presentation again. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Before we jump into Q&A, actually, I had this as the last thing, but I might just jump in and talk a bit about that now. Christy mentioned about some of the data assets. We're going to, as part of this thing, produce a guide for small business. So we've touched on a lot of subjects here, and I thought we'll produce a guide that we'll distribute as well, that will give you a bit more information on what you can do from your small business and how you can access some of these assets and what you can do from there. And also, we've just recently, as part of this, created our own resource page. Like SEER have got some those, but we've got on the resource page, which is on begavalley.data.com.au, we've got over 30 links to different data. So, and as Christy mentioned, some of those are census data, some are more, some are have already got filtered data on the Bega Valley, but some also have data that's available across New South Wales or nationwide. And there's a whole stack, and we're coming across all that even more. But interesting, what we found is that putting those resources together, there's so much resources, so much data out there. You really need a way to develop that into your own story and to analyse it a bit more to make sense of it all. So certainly it's not a lack of data where you can access it. It's just, I think, the thing that's missing, and I'll ask Christy the question a bit later, on how we go about what's the next step in doing that. And I just quickly also mention Workability Bega. There you'll find a bit of information on that resource page about them. They're a partner, or can be your own partners in employment. And in this, for small business, we always talk about this tight labour market we're in at the moment. They've got a lot of willing participants that can be part of your small business. So if you're thinking of employing, I'd give them a ring and see what they can do for you.